Golden hour enters the dusty Boston atelier like it is afraid to disturb the room. It lands on the vintage wedding gown, on the chalk marks, on the third-generation tailor's hands, and finally on the heavy iron shears resting beside the silk. Then comes the sound. Shirr. Blades through fabric. Most people think legacy disappears in one dramatic moment. It usually doesn't. It fades when the hand gets careless. When the eye stops measuring. When the last person who knows the work begins to believe no one will care after him. He is not just altering a gown. He is standing at the edge of a family name. What do you do when the craft you inherited feels like it may end with you? This is where Zanshin begins, not in grand speeches, but in attention. In breath. In the next clean cut. Samurai discipline will not remove the fear. It will teach him how to stand correctly inside it. The tailor stands alone in the atelier, but the room is not empty. His grandfather is there in the long wooden cutting table, scarred by decades of chalk lines and pin marks. His father is there in the old measuring tapes curled in a drawer, yellowed at the edges, still carrying the faint smell of cloth and hand soap. Every spool of thread, every paper pattern, every bent needle in the little magnetic dish seems to ask the same question without mercy. Will this end with you? The gown lies open beneath the golden light. It is vintage, delicate, not fragile exactly, but carrying the kind of weight that has nothing to do with fabric. Someone wore it before. Someone stood in a church aisle or a city hall or a backyard under string lights and made a promise inside this silk. Now another woman is trusting him to alter it without erasing what it has already lived through. That is the pressure of craftsmanship. The object is not just an object. And the tool is not just a tool. The heavy iron shears sit in his hand with a seriousness that modern things rarely have. They do not feel disposable. They do not flatter him. They are cold at first, then warm slowly under his fingers, as if they are deciding whether he still deserves them. When he opens the blades, there is a slight resistance in the hinge. When he closes them through the silk, the sound is clean and low. Shirr. It should steady him. Instead, for a moment, it exposes him. Because the fear beneath his ribs is not really about this one wedding gown. It is not about one wrong cut, one crooked seam, one client's disappointment. That would be simple. That would be repairable. His fear is older and quieter. He is afraid that he is the final page of a book no one will reprint. A third-generation tailor is not just a man with a trade. He is a corridor. Behind him are hands that knew how to shape wool around shoulders, how to let out a waist without insulting the body inside it, how to hem a dress so the movement looked natural, not corrected. Behind him are men who did not need to speak loudly about pride because their stitches did it for them. But outside the atelier, Boston moves fast. Coffee orders, ride shares, glass offices, same-day shipping, clothes bought with a thumb and returned without a thought. People still want things to fit, but fewer people understand what fitting costs. Fewer people know the patience hidden inside a clean line. So when he lowers the shears to the gown, his hand does not only carry skill. It carries inheritance. It carries doubt. And doubt has a way of making the hand stupid. Not untrained. Not weak. Just slightly hurried in the places where hurry becomes damage. His eyes jump ahead to the finished dress. His mind wanders toward the empty future of the atelier. He imagines the sign outside fading, the rent rising, the phone ringing less, the old customers disappearing one by one. He imagines some younger person looking through the window and seeing not a living craft, but a museum with bad lighting. That is how the shadow moves. It does not shout. It steals attention. A careless person fails because he does not respect the work. But a frightened craftsman can fail because he respects the work so much that he stops seeing the inch in front of him. He becomes trapped between reverence and panic. His love for the craft turns into pressure against the blade. The silk does not care about his family history. It only responds to the cut he makes now. That is the hard mercy of the present moment. The gown is not asking him to save tailoring in America. It is asking him to follow the chalk line. It is asking him to feel the weight of the shears, to listen for the rhythm, to keep the fabric flat under his palm. It is asking for attention, not drama. But fear loves drama. Fear wants a stage. It wants the entire family legacy gathered behind one cut, judging him. It wants the tailor to believe that if his hand trembles, it means he is unworthy. It wants him to confuse emotion with evidence. This is where many people lose command in their own craft. A carpenter stops seeing the grain because he is thinking about the deadline. A nurse stops hearing the patient's voice because the hallway is too full. A student stops reading the sentence because the future keeps yelling about failure. A father stops listening to his child because he is trying to solve 10 years of worry in one conversation. The mistake is not having fear. The mistake is letting fear widen the frame until the task becomes impossible. Zanshin narrows the frame without making the world small. It is a disciplined awareness that stays open, but does not scatter. It sees the whole room, then returns to the point of contact. In this atelier, Zanshin is not mystical. It is the tailor noticing that his thumb is pressing too hard into the handle. It is the way he lets his shoulders drop 1 inch. It is the pause before the next cut, not because he is frozen, but because he is listening. The rhythmic shirr of the blades through silk becomes a test. When he is ruled by fear, the sound turns into a countdown. Every cut seems to bring him closer to proving the worst thing he believes about himself, that he cannot carry what was handed down to him. But when he returns to attention, the same sound becomes a metronome. Shirr. Measure. Shirr. Breathe. Shirr. Stay. The outside scene barely changes. Dust motes still drift in the golden light. The old radiator still ticks somewhere near the wall. The gown still lies across the table with pins catching small points of sun. But inside him, there is a difference between a man trying to rescue his entire bloodline and a craftsman making the next precise movement. One is crushed by legacy. The other serves it. And there is a severe kind of humility in that. He cannot force the world to value what his grandfather valued. He cannot make every person understand the dignity of a hand-altered seam. He cannot stop time from moving, or customers from changing, or old neighborhoods from becoming something his father would hardly recognize. But he can refuse to betray the work while it is still in his hands. That refusal is not loud. No one applauds it. There is no speech, no cinematic swell of music, no moment where the fear disappears and leaves him pure. His jaw still tightens. His mind still reaches toward the question he hates. Last of my kind. Last of my kind. Last of my kind. Then the shears open again. And he comes back. This is the confrontation. Not man against fabric. Not old tradition against modern life. The real confrontation is between attention and inheritance distorted by fear. Because legacy can strengthen a man, but it can also haunt him if he thinks he must prove all of it at once. The undisciplined reaction would be to rush, to overcorrect, to grip the shears too tightly, to treat one wedding gown as a verdict on his entire life. He might cut faster to escape the feeling. He might become harsh with the cloth, impatient with the client's request, resentful toward a world that no longer bows to his trade. But the disciplined reaction is smaller, cleaner, harder. He lets the fear be present without letting it hold the handle. He places his palm on the silk. He checks the chalk line. He listens for the shirr. He becomes worthy of the next inch. That is Zanshin in craftsmanship. The mind does not drift into nostalgia. It does not run ahead into extinction. It does not turn a tool into a weapon against the self. It stays with the blade, the cloth, the breath, the duty of this exact moment. The tailor may be the last of his kind. He may not be. That answer is not available in the golden hour. What is available is the cut. And sometimes the only honorable way to carry a legacy is to stop staring at its shadow and return your full attention to the work still asking for your hands. Discipline does not begin after you feel calm. It begins in the first second you realize you are about to lose command. For the tailor, that second arrives with the shears half open. The gown is spread beneath him. The golden hour is thinning now, lowering across the dusty atelier, turning the floating dust into a quiet weather of its own. The silk waits. The chalk line waits. The old table waits. And his mind tries to leave the room. It wants to run decades forward. It wants to see the shop closed, the windows dark, the family name scraped off the glass. But the hand cannot serve the future while the eye abandons the fabric. So his first act of training is not heroic. It is almost invisible. He stops. Not forever. Not dramatically. Just long enough to keep fear from becoming motion. The shears remain open in his hand. He does not cut to escape the pressure. He does not rush because the silence feels heavy. He lets one breath enter, then lets it leave through his nose. In his mind, he names the feeling with plain words: fear of being the last. That naming matters. When fear stays unnamed, it pretends to be wisdom. It says, hurry. It says, prove yourself. It says, this cut is your entire life. But when he names it, it becomes smaller. Still real. Still painful. But no longer in command. Then he returns to the body. His thumb relaxes inside the handle of the heavy iron shears. His fingers loosen just enough to feel the tool instead of strangling it. He notices the cold weight against his palm, the slight drag in the hinge, the way the lower blade wants to rest flat beneath the silk. This is the second act of training: anchor the body in the present. Not with a slogan. With contact. The shears are not there to carry his panic. They are there to cut cleanly. The fabric is not there to answer whether his craft will survive. It is there to be respected. His palm presses lightly near the chalk line, not hard enough to distort the gown, just firm enough to keep the silk from shifting. He looks once at the whole garment. Then he returns to 1 inch. That is the third act: shrink the battle. A frightened mind turns a single task into a trial for the soul. It drags the dead, the living, and the unborn into the same room. It puts the grandfather behind one shoulder, the father behind the other, and the empty future directly in front of the blade. No hand can cut well under that crowd. So the tailor refuses the crowd. He does not have to save the atelier in this minute. He does not have to convince Boston to honor old trades. He does not have to know whether a fourth generation will ever stand at this table. He has to cut to the pin. Only to the pin. The blade's close. Sure. Then they stop. He checks the line again. This is the fourth act: build a ritual the mind can trust. Measure. Breathe. Cut. Stop. Look. Not because he lacks skill. Because skill without ritual becomes vulnerable to mood. A ritual gives the hand a road back when the mind starts wandering. He adjusts the gown by sliding the silk, not pulling it. He smooths the fabric with the side of his hand. He checks how the light catches the seam. He lowers his face closer, not from anxiety, but from respect. He listens to the shears, because the sound tells him what his eyes might miss. A clean shear means the blades are moving true. A rough sound would mean he is forcing the tool or catching the fabric wrong. Measure. Breathe. Cut. Stop. Look. Again. Again. The atelier becomes smaller, but not poorer. The world outside is still there. Traffic still moves somewhere beyond the old windows. Someone passes on the sidewalk. A phone could ring. A bill could arrive. The future could still be uncertain. But the center of his life, for this moment, is the place where iron meets silk. This is not escape. It is command. The fifth act is to separate memory from duty. He lets himself remember his grandfather's hands, but he does not let memory blur the chalk line. He lets himself feel the weight of his father's standards, but he does not turn those standards into punishment. He understands that inheritance is not a ghost standing over him. It is a set of practices waiting to be repeated with care. The old men are not asking him to suffer beautifully. They are asking him to do the work properly. So he threads a needle without stabbing at the air. He lays the thread across his finger to check the length. He sets the shears down with the blades closed, always in the same place, always facing away from the gown. He brushes loose threads into a small pile instead of letting them scatter. Each small order protects the next movement. That is how craftsmanship trains the mind. Not through intensity. Through return. A person who wants to master himself often imagines some massive inner battle. A dramatic breakthrough. A speech in the mirror. A clean victory over doubt. But in the atelier, mastery looks like this: one man noticing that his shoulders have risen, then lowering them. One hand pausing before a cut. One breath taken before answering the fear. One tool placed back where it belongs. The shadow still speaks. You may be the last. He does not argue with it. He places 2 fingers on the silk and checks the seam allowance. The shadow says, no one will care. He turns the gown slightly into the light. The shadow says, everything your family built may vanish. He opens the heavy iron shears and listens for the hinge. This is the deeper training, not defeating the thought, but refusing to organize the hand around it. There are moments when the rhythm steadies him so completely that the fear steps back. Not gone. Just farther away. The shirr of the blades becomes less like a warning and more like a vow. Each cut says, while this work is mine, I will not abandon it. Each pause says, while this tool is in my hand, I will not rush to escape myself. The gown slowly changes shape. Not enough for a stranger to notice from across the room. But enough for a trained eye. The line becomes cleaner. The fall of the silk becomes truer. The old dress begins to make room for a new bride without losing the dignity of the woman who wore it before. That is the lesson hidden in alteration. You do not preserve legacy by freezing it. You preserve it by handling change with reverence. The tailor cannot keep the fabric exactly as it was. That would betray the client. He cannot cut without care. That would betray the dress. His task is to stand between memory and use, between yesterday and tomorrow, and make a line so precise that both can live. That is Zanshin. Full attention, extended through the hand. The practice is simple, but not easy. Stop before fear becomes motion. Name the shadow without obeying it. Feel the weight of the tool. Return to 1 inch. Make ritual out of precision. Then repeat until the mind learns that the present is not too small to hold you. By the time the sun lowers further, the atelier has grown quiet in a different way. Not the silence of a dying trade. The silence of work being honored. The shears rest beside the gown. The tailor lifts them again. Not to prove that legacy will survive forever. To make the next cut worthy of it, the light in the atelier changes before the tailor does. Golden hour begins to drain from the windows, leaving a softer amber along the cutting table. The dust motes still move, but slower now, as if the room has stopped performing and started breathing. The vintage wedding gown lies across the old wood, no longer a problem to survive, no longer a verdict waiting to fall. It is cloth. It is memory. It is a task. The heavy iron shears rest beside it with their blades closed. Earlier, those shears felt like judgment. Their weight seemed to carry every hand that came before his. His grandfather's. His father's. All the quiet men who measured twice, cut once, and believed that a person's work should be able to speak when the person was gone. Now the shears feel different. Not lighter. Truer. He picks them up and notices the hinge again, the same small resistance, the same cold weight becoming warm in his palm. Nothing mystical has happened. The rent is still due. The neighborhood is still changing. The old customers are still aging. The future of the atelier is still uncertain. But his relationship to uncertainty has shifted. He no longer asks the shears to answer what they cannot answer. He asks them to cut. This is transformation in the real world. It does not arrive like thunder. It does not erase fear from the body. It does not make a man suddenly confident about every year ahead of him. Real transformation often looks almost disappointing from the outside. A man stands in the same room. With the same tool. Over the same fabric. Only now, he is no longer abandoning the present to argue with the future. The blades open. He places his left hand on the silk, gentle enough not to stretch it, steady enough not to let it slide. His eyes do not jump toward the window. They do not wander to the faded photographs near the back wall. They do not go searching for proof that his life will matter. They stay on the chalk. The cut begins. Sure. Clean. Low. Exact. The sound no longer frightens him with its finality. A cut is permanent, yes, but permanence is not always a threat. Sometimes permanence is what gives care its dignity. You cannot be careless with what cannot be undone. You cannot pretend attention is optional when the blade is already moving. That is why craft makes a person honest. There are no speeches inside a crooked hem. No excuses hidden in a jagged line. The fabric records the truth of the hand. Earlier, he wanted to carry the whole family legacy in one heroic act. Now he understands something quieter. Legacy is not carried all at once. It is carried in inches. One clean cut. One measured seam. One tool returned to its place. One client treated with care. One old method kept alive because, today, someone still chose to use it well. The gown begins to take its new shape. Not dramatically. Not like a transformation montage made for easy applause. The change is subtle. A side seam softened. A waist brought in without stealing the dress's original grace. A hem adjusted so it can move with a new body, a new walk, a new ceremony. He pauses and lifts the fabric gently from the table. The silk falls differently now. That is the proof. Not the fear disappearing. Not the future becoming safe. The proof is in the line. The dress can belong to tomorrow without being stripped of yesterday. And something in him recognizes the same possibility. Maybe he does not have to preserve the family name by keeping everything untouched. Maybe he does not have to become a museum guard for his own bloodline. Maybe the craft survives, if it survives, because he lets it meet the present without surrendering its standards. He looks around the atelier. The room is dusty. It needs repairs. The shelves carry too much history and not enough space. There are stains on the floor from years of steam, polish, coffee, rainwater tracked in by customers. A younger version of him might have felt embarrassed by the age of the place. A frightened version might have seen only decline. Now he sees evidence. People worked here. People trusted this room with their weddings, interviews, funerals, graduations, apologies, second chances. Men stood on the fitting platform trying not to look nervous. Mothers cried quietly while sleeves were pinned. Brides held their breath while a dress became theirs. The atelier was never just a business. It was a place where fabric learned the shape of human moments. That does not guarantee it will last forever. But it means it was never meaningless. The shadow tries once more. You may still be the last. This time, the thought lands differently. It is still sad. Still sharp at the edges. But it no longer owns the room. He does not grip the shears harder. He does not rush. He does not turn grief into carelessness. He lowers the gown back onto the table and checks the seam. If he is the last, then the last will not be sloppy. If he is the last, then the last will stand with attention. If he is not the last, then someone who comes after him will need more than stories. They will need to see how the work is done. His posture changes with that thought. Not proud. Not dramatic. Just aligned. He sets the shears down with intention, blades closed, iron against wood. The sound is small but firm. Then he reaches for the needle. The thread slides through the eye after 2 attempts. He almost smiles at that. Even mastery has ordinary moments. Even trained hands miss the hole once in a while. He begins to sew. The rhythm is slower than cutting. In, through, pull. In, through, pull. The silk gathers, then releases. The seam becomes less like a correction and more like a conversation between past and future. This is modern samurai discipline without costume, without myth, without pretending life is cleaner than it is. It is a man in Boston staying present with his work while fear stands nearby. It is awareness sharp enough to notice a drifting hand. It is respect deep enough to close the blades before setting the tool down. It is ritual strong enough to bring the mind back when the world offers no guarantee. The transformation is not that he stops caring whether the craft dies. Only a cold man would stop caring. The transformation is that he no longer lets that fear corrupt the work that remains alive in front of him. There is a difference between mourning the future and betraying the present. He chooses the present. Outside, the last gold of the day touches the shop window. Inside, the gown is nearly finished. The tailor steps back, not far, just enough to see the whole piece. The alteration is quiet. It does not announce itself. That is how he knows it is right. The dress still looks like itself, only more ready for the life it is about to enter. He runs his hand near the seam without pressing. Then he looks at the heavy iron shears. At the beginning of the day, they were a burden. In the middle, they became an anchor. Now they are a promise. Not that the shop will survive. Not that the world will turn back toward patient hands and old trades. Not that legacy will reward him for loving it. The promise is simpler. While the shears are in his hand, attention will not die. And maybe that is how legacy continues, not by begging the future to remember you, but by making the present so carefully that it becomes worthy of being remembered. Mastery begins when the smallest detail becomes worthy of your full attention. Maybe your atelier is not in Boston. Maybe it is an office desk, a kitchen table, a late night commute, a school assignment, a family promise, a job no one thanks you for. But you know the feeling. You know what it is to hold something important in your hands and fear that you are not enough to carry it forward. The tailor's lesson is not that fear disappears when the work matters. It is that the work must not be punished because fear arrived. So return to the inch in front of you. Close the blades when they should be closed. Open them when the cut is honest. Listen for the shirr. Respect the fabric. And if this message met you at the right hour, stay with this channel. While the shears are in your hand, attention will not die.